Hello everyone, Derek Barefoot back with you on the Typologetics YouTube channel with my wife May and our continuing object of study, prophetic portrayals, and we're looking at the case of the Gadarene demoniac or Gerasene demoniac and his healing and what prophetic meaning that might hold. Let's open with prayer. Father, thank you for all the insight we gain from the scriptures into our own time, into past history, into the future, and the hope we have for the kingdom of your Son. In his name we pray. Amen. Mm-hmm. All right. So, we were looking at this episode, which is contained in Mark, the first part of chapter 5, but also in Matthew chapter 8 and in Luke chapter 8, and the ways in which this demoniac resembled the Jewish nation through its history, in that the Jewish nation was also, rebelling regularly against whatever outside empire or national authority God allowed to rule over them for his own purposes. They would rebel and bring even more judgment on themselves, of course, most famously at the time of the Babylonian exile when the temple was destroyed. But there's that sort of correspondence. We saw, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew in the 8th chapter, it said explicitly that he was violent. You know, we had from Mark that they would try to confine him with chains and he would break them. In Luke, it said he went without clothing. Back in Mark, it said that he would scream and cut himself with stones. You know, it's sort of self-destructive. These tendencies were there among the Jewish people, like we said, at various times of rebellion, even not in the Bible, but in the case of the Romans. They initially resisted Roman rule, and that resulted in a lot of deaths and needless destruction in Jerusalem. Before we go even farther into the story, I'd like to go back to Luke and see just another instance to reinforce this yet one more time, all right, before we go forward with it. So if you go to Luke, and this account is contained in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, starts in verse 26. May's here to read for us. And I want you to notice something else about this man. So first of all, at 26, they go over to the country of the Gerasenes. The man comes out who had been living in the tombs. We learned from Luke that he was a former resident of the city. He cries out with a loud voice to Jesus. And now let's read verse 29. There's a little added detail from Luke that is of interest that we should note.
Just 29.
Yeah, verse 29, please.
For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it had seized him many times, and he was bound with chains and shackles and kept under guard, and yet he would break his bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Okay.
So you get that. It's very much like in Mark. He was bound, but he would break the bond. It says he was kept under guard. That's another. So in other words, maybe they'd post people to kind of look and see what was happening with him. But it said that the demon would drive him into the desert. Now, literally, it just simply means this word for desert here. We might picture a very dry, waterless place. The Judean desert was to the south of there, maybe meaning that, but it just means into uninhabited areas. The basic meaning of it is an uninhabited area. So out in the wilds, we might say, it might be a little closer English equivalent, but it does say that driven into the desert. And if you think about this, the Jewish nation in Judea as a seat of frequent rebellion, put it that way. Well, we find an interesting note about that in the book of Acts. So if you go over to Acts chapter 21, and the setting of this is that Paul had returned to Jerusalem, bringing offerings for the poor Christians of Judea because they lived in a really poor area, and Paul's churches were relatively more wealthy, so he had taken up a collection for them. And then a disturbance arises when Paul is recognized in the region of the temple grounds, and there's a mob that forms, and the Romans have to rescue him from the crowd there. And so if you go down in chapter 21 to verse 37 and 38.
Okay. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness."
Okay, so, in other words, because there was a disturbance over Paul, the commander of the Roman cohort here in Jerusalem, when he had to come sort this out, take Paul into custody, sort of assuming that Paul was some kind of troublemaker, maybe known as some violent figure, and so he asks him about this violent figure of presumably of recent history there. It says, "Are you not the Egyptian," meaning a Jew from Egypt, maybe Alexandria, where there are many Jews, who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins. Notice where? Out into the where?
Wilderness.
Out into the wilderness. So this is essentially the same as out into the desert. Okay, it's the same idea here. So in other words, these assassins or revolutionaries, basically, some kind of insurgents. It's what it's talking about. Someone who's resisting Roman rule or wanting to overthrow Roman rule, overthrow maybe the local, Herodian rule, which is in Galilee, or somehow otherwise to violently change the political complexion of Judea. We can put it that way. That they had gone out, taken refuge in a wilderness area, obviously, so they wouldn't be subject to immediate capture and being killed by the Romans or by Herod's forces or whatever. But it's interesting that their violent agenda drives them out into the wilderness, just like a demon back in this had driven the man out into the wilderness, and and that's a note that we have from Luke that we don't have from Matthew and Mark, but it fits together, showing how this man's syndrome sort of recreated the violent tendencies of the nation. Now, last time I mentioned that this man is existing in this extremely it's a kind of a uniformly unclean environment. All right. So when Jesus steps off the boat, as it were, he's met by a man with an unclean spirit. Nearby, unclean animals are feeding. It's the swine. When we refer, the pigs, they're unclean under the law. There are these unclean animals, a large herd of them, feeding nearby. There's an unclean city. It seems to be a mostly Gentile city, which is the only way that you'd have a large herd of pigs being fed, is because the meat is being sold locally. Excuse me, so that there may have been a small Jewish quarter or something, but apparently it's a primarily Gentile city close by. So it's like the whole environment is an unclean environment. Unclean Gentile people, unclean animals, tombs, is the graveyard where the man lives. That's a highly unclean, ceremonially unclean environment for Jews. And then an unclean spirit. And as I said last time, there's this name, because it turns out to be many spirits, the name Legion, because of the many, but a name that also has militaristic resonances, because of course the Roman legions. So with all of that in mind, think about, as I asked last time, I think in our last installment, that there is a separation that occurs when Jesus finally casts out these demons and they go into the pigs. It's sort of, creates an island of cleanness, I should say. It's an island of cleanness where the man himself is because of having been delivered from these demons. So, if we would look, so hold your place in Luke, because we're going to be coming right back here. But if you go back to Mark chapter 5, first part of Mark 5, where this account is in Mark. And here's another case where the accounts complement each other. Because once the demons leave the man, notice the description. So, May, if you would read verse 15 of Mark 5.
They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed in his right mind, the very man who had a legion, and they became frightened.
Okay, so these are people from the city who are coming out to see what all this commotion is, but they see the man sitting down. So he was violent. People are afraid to go by that area. Even we found in Matthew, but now he's quiescent. He's quiet. He's sitting down. He's clothed. Remember in Luke it said that he'd gone naked or without normal clothing at any rate, in his right mind. So no longer acting insane and wild in that way. It was such a dramatic change that the people are frightened to see it. They think, even though it should be something that would be welcome, it is so dramatic that they sense that there is a great power at work here. Okay. But now, you go back to Luke, in the 8th chapter of Luke, because again, we get some additional details in Luke 8. So Luke 8 is verse 35. It's the parallel to what we just read in Mark. So Luke 8 and verse 35.
Just 35.
Yeah, let's just read 35 right now.
Then a voice came out of the cloud.
This is Luke 8:35.
Oh, okay, 35. The people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting down at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind, and they became frightened.
Okay, so now, just like in Mark, it says that he's sitting, he's clothed, he's in his right mind, but there's an added detail. I don't know if you caught it. It doesn't say that he's just sitting down, does it? It tells us exactly where he's sitting.
At the feet of Jesus.
He's sitting at the feet of Jesus. Remember, Mark said he was just sitting, but he's sitting at Jesus' feet. Now, the reason that's important is because to sit at someone's feet is the position of a disciple, a student. A student will sit down at your feet to catch every word that the teacher is saying. So if you hold your place there in Luke and go over to Acts again, and this time we'll go to Acts chapter 22. And May, if you could read for us Acts 22, verse 3. And now I should introduce this by saying this is where Paul is making his defense. We'd seen that Paul, there's a rescue of Paul, and there's a long episode in these 3 or 4 chapters of Paul's adventures in Jerusalem before he's finally transferred to Rome. So this is when he's making one of his defenses before the Jewish crowd. And so, May please read verse 3, Paul's explanation of his background.
I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as you all are today. Okay,
so he's explaining that he had been a good, observant Jew. Not just that, he was He was actually a Pharisee, so he was trained in the law. But it says, notice that he says, we're reading from the NASB, New American Standard Bible. It says, educated under Gamaliel. But in our study Bibles here, it has a little note where it says, where the phrase under Gamaliel occurs. And then if you go over to the center column to see an actual literal reading, we find that it says the literal reading is at the feet of. And in fact, if you go to the other translations, like if you're looking in a King James, probably a New King James, I didn't look this up, but maybe even a New King James, it says that I learned, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. All right, so because that's the position of a disciple. There are other examples of that too, but here I thought that's enough to note one. You could find other examples if you go into a concordance and look with this. But the man has adopted the position of a disciple. You know, so he's gone from being demon-possessed to clothed, and also there's a connotation that nakedness is the shame of sin or disgrace, and then being clothed is a sign of righteousness, of acquiring some purity again. Of course, it's not absolute sinlessness we're not talking about, but of recovering a spiritual right standing. Of course, in the New Testament that happens through Jesus, but we find in Revelation, for example, where it says, talking about the end times, it says, blessed is the one who keeps his outer garment that he won't be found naked. And you find other cases where this picture of nakedness versus being clothed has that, being found in a state of great sin and guilt, as opposed to being found in a state of purity and holiness, and on a holy path, as it were. Of course, in Revelation, and that they're washed, their clothes are washed in the blood of the Lamb, for example. But the fact that he goes from nakedness to being clothed, that he goes to being wild and out of his mind, to sitting at Jesus' feet, all of this suggests the way that this event is foreshadowing a larger or making visible a larger reality that's taking place. And it's this: when Jesus comes to the Jewish nation as a whole, he finds a generally spiritually unclean environment. That is in his larger mission, because he finds an unclean environment. But there's a part of that environment that Jesus begins to cleanse with his words and teachings and with his call on people. And of course, what part of the nation begins to be cleansed? It's his
people, Israel.
Yeah, but in other words, who listens to Jesus?
His apostle.
The disciple, the apostles, the disciples. In other words, the people who come to Jesus genuinely wanting to hear and putting faith in him. That's the part of the nation that recovers a sound mind, that begins to put on the garments of salvation, as the expression is, I say in Isaiah, who comes and is segregated out of this violent disposition that takes hold of the Jewish nation. We read in Luke where it says, if only you had known those things that make for peace. Jesus indicating that so often peace was violated. So it's the disciples, those who came to sit at Jesus' feet, who were cleansed from the spiritual forces contaminating the nation. And that's what happens in this scene. This segregation occurs where the man becomes this little island of as it were, relative purity, right-mindedness, and so on, just as the disciples as a whole do. So this thing starts to take shape, because if you remembered in the end of the story, the people in the city and its surroundings there, they don't want Jesus. They sense that there's some kind of power, but they ask him to leave. They're not comfortable with it. They don't want to learn more about it. You'd think that they would because this man had been a danger. Now he's not. But no, they want Jesus to leave, and that's what happens with the Jewish nation as a whole, and their Gentile partners. Pilate would just as soon get rid of Jesus. In other words, all of them would be happier to be rid of whatever the power Jesus represents, except for the disciples. And what happens since we're in Luke here, if you go to down to verse 38. So in verse 37, it says that they ask Jesus to leave. They want to be rid of Jesus. But now read verse 38.
But the man from whom the demons had gone out was begging him that he might accompany him. But he sent him away, saying, "Return to your house and describe what great things God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him.
Okay, so get this. We noted at the beginning of this study that Jesus usually commands people to remain quiet about him, not to go and spread, what miracles he's done and this kind of thing. Then there was a certain purpose to that. But this is an exceptional case where, that Jesus says, go out, go out and tell what God has done for you. And but the man, before receiving his commission, before Jesus gives him the commission to proclaim the good things of God, the man wants to go with Jesus. So that should remind you of something. So since we're in Luke, if you simply turn over to when Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper with the disciples, so Luke chapter 22, if we read, say, starting, let's go ahead and start with verse 28 and read through 32. Read through 34. So we're going to read 28 through 34 of Luke 22.
Okay.
It's sort of killing somewhat indiscriminately, mostly going after the rebels, but not being some others. Try to take refuge by going down into the caverns below Jerusalem, because that whole area is limestone, which means that water dissolves it, which means that under Jerusalem there are caverns, waterways. We find that noted in the Old Testament, and he says that the Romans chased down into the caverns and captured one of the rebel leaders, who was John. I think it's John of Gischala, I think is his full name, if I'm remembering that right. But here's an interesting note. He says, and this is under section 4 of chapter 9, he says, the Romans slew some of them, some they carried captives, others they made search for underground. So that's in the caverns under the city. He says, and when they found where they were, when they found where they were, they broke up the ground and slew all they met with. There were also found slain there, that is, already slain underground when the Romans got there, above 2,000 persons, partly by their own hands and partly by one another, but chiefly destroyed by the famine. And then he goes on to talk about the capture of John, one of the rebel leaders in these underground caverns. And he also talks about Simon, the other main leader. It's not completely clear that he was captured underground, but possibly because it's mentioned along with close by the capture of John. But here's the point. We could probably assume that most of these were rebels, as it says some of them had killed each other because the rebels began fighting among themselves. But he said they found those who had gone down into the caverns, 2,000 that had destroyed themselves in the process of doing that. Well, if you remember, that's the number of the pigs that the demons went into and drove to their destruction into the waters. If you go back to our accounts, it says about 2,000. So it's about 2,000 who went down to their own destruction during the siege of Jerusalem. And in context, it seems to be mostly rebels, or led by the rebels, and since many of them destroyed each other when they were down there. But he says, I guess even larger number who starved to death there. But it's hard to, who knows for sure, but that corresponds to that number. It's well, of course, there were many more than 2,000 people killed, but they well could stand for those who sort of went off into their own destruction in this revolt against Rome. So I'm just saying things kind of fall into place for a prophetic way to look at this episode, but we will continue with that next time since our time is up. So let's close with prayer. Father, thank you for your direction of us, for the light you shine ahead of our steps. Please do continue to guide and sustain us by your Spirit till we're together again. In Christ's name we pray. And don't forget to give us your likes, comments, subscribe if you haven't done so, and we'll see you here next time.